and good evening. Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Welcome from wherever you're joining us today in the world. I hope and I pray that you and your families are staying healthy and staying safe. I would like to start by congratulating Maritime SheEO, as well as their collaborators, the Ocean Opportunity Lab, on hosting this first conference around diversity and sustainability in the maritime sector. I would also like to take this opportunity to send a big hello and a thank you to Brigitte for her kind invitation to join you today. We had the honor and the privilege of hosting Brigitte during her travels through the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia last March 2020. Brigitte, who would have thought that the culmination and the excitement we discussed of your travels would have ended up being a virtual event? I remember how excited we were and contemplating meeting up during this time face to face. But I do hope and pray that we all stay well and stay safe and we're able to have this conversation in the near future face to face. When I think about the oceans, 71% of Earth's space is taken up by the oceans. And yet, 95% of that ocean is completely unexplored. Our knowledge of the ocean, when compared to, say, our knowledge of outer space, or at least the parts of outer space that we know and can explore, is shockingly thin. And I often think that that is somewhat how we think about each other. We know much more about our differences and we focus much more on our differences than we do on our similarities and our joint goals and those joint benefits to all of us by focusing on those goals. Growing up, I loved the topic of this when I heard smashing stereotypes, because I remember growing up, I have to disclose here, I come from a personally very diverse background. There is Egyptian, Saudi, American. I married a Palestinian, so we even brought in even more diversity as I grew older. But growing up, I spent my year in Saudi Arabia and my summers in a very rural area in the United States with my grandparents there. And I remember traveling, and every time I would go and meet up with people, particularly back then, I would often get asked the question, do I ride camels wherever I go? And do I have an oil well in my backyard? And this continued to be asked well into the 90s and late 90s. So it wasn't even like just within the 80s. As telecommunication and reach became available, reach and ability to look at other cultures, those stereotypes were further ingrained in the various cultures that I would meet and interact with. And I always found it very fascinating as a child how these stereotypes kind of stuck and defined you, and how it defined how people treated you. Hence, from a very early age, I became very interested in cultures, languages, traditions. Again, having grown up in a family where compromise, accommodations, supporting each other, but having a unified goal, which was the well-being of the family, was paramount and priority. It gave me a good mini ecosystem to what I would be doing for my career for the rest of my life. So as I've stated, I've spent maybe the past 30 years or so working in the area of diversity and inclusion. And I want to share with you just a brief story that for me was sort of a game changer in a sense. And it happened later on in my career, fairly recently, within the past year. I worked on a project where we went out and we were working with rural communities within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in an area that was more on, the seafront. My job and my role on this project was to look at diversity and inclusion in developing tourist activities, outdoor activities for the future, for visitors when they come, and how do we make that as diverse and inclusive as possible, which again meant a variety, males, females, various ages, various abilities, persons with disabilities, etc. So I remember when I first went out, and we were actually out on a boat, and I was discussing this with one of the divers, and he was asking, well, what is your role on this project, and how can we support you, and how can we best understand what you do? And I said, well, I'm actually working to see who in the community has disabilities and how we can include them and make sure that they're included in the upcoming activities and developments that will happen, and so that no one gets left behind. And I had asked the question prior to coming out to our local guide. I had specifically asked, were there any individuals with disabilities living in the community? And I got a resounding no. It is a smaller community compared to the big cities that I live in, Riyadh, which is a city of 8 million people. This was a small fishing area that was about 70,000 people. And it was a very clear, resounding no. So as I was describing what I did to the diver, the local guide was listening, and he jumped in and he said, what do you mean by disability? And I said, well, for me, it was very clear. The term persons with disabilities is quite self-explanatory, but I had mentioned, people who maybe can't walk, they have difficulty hearing, seeing, some of the cognitive disabilities. And he immediately jumped in. He goes, we don't have anybody with disabilities, but I do have a guy who's a diver. He's educated, he's graduated, he's going to be getting married soon, but he doesn't have arms. Would he qualify as somebody with a disability for you? And I remember that was the first time where it hit me that as long as you can contribute in your community, and as long as you're accepted, and as long as people have expectations of you that can be met, and you meet those expectations, then you may not actually have a disability. Now, I realize that because that's my life's work. However, it was fascinating to contemplate that from the perspective of the social definition of who has a disability. On that same trip, we actually went out to meet a family who still lived a nomadic life. They lived out in tents. It was a family of elderly parents in their 80s, a gentleman in his mid-30s, his sister and her family, her husband and her children, who all still lived out a nomadic life. They would go out with the camels and the goats, or the lambs, and they herded, and that's what they did their whole lives. And I remember as we were sitting there with the team, it was very obvious as this 30-some-odd-year-old, the eldest son, came up to greet us. He was the one who greeted us, and he served us coffee and tea, which is, an honor. And it shows his position and his value within the family structure, that he's the one hosting the guest and honoring the guests. It was very clear to me that this gentleman had what is diagnosed today as Down syndrome. And I remember sitting there with my team members on the project, and they said, are you going to ask him about his disability? And I said, I'm actually not going to, because it was quite obvious that he was treated as a full equal within this community. And I just asked, did you have any difficulties growing up? And he described that he didn't walk until he was about 7, but he crawled very fast everywhere. And his speed was like one of his best qualities when he was young. And his dad chimed in and said, yes, we could barely keep up with him. He said, so I asked him, how did you learn how to walk? And he said, well, one day, my younger brother, one of his younger siblings who no longer lived with them in the desert, had broken his leg, and the doctor had come out to set it, and he noticed that he was given a crutch. So he went out, crawled, and found a stick that he could use, and used it as a crutch and taught himself how to walk. Again, this was another example of how these individuals in this community did not perceive him as having a disability. They expected him to meet the needs and the social contract of everybody's role within this tribe or this smaller community that they had formed. So I challenge everyone to think about our definitions. How do we revise them? How do we think about them? And how do we go about defining who belongs to what category? Mindset is critical when it comes to what we do in diversity, and particularly when it comes to sustainability. Our mindset starting at diversity, and then our expectations and how we live up to those mindsets for sustainability. So yes, that was a very enlightening moment to me. And again, if I think about the number of people who live in this world, we use a lot of slogans and a lot of the activities that I participate in, whether it's along the lines of human rights discussions, legislation, policy, assessments, interventions, program development. We use phrases like no one left behind, inclusion for all, opportunities for all. And I often feel the weight of that, and I sit down, when it's me, myself, and I think 7.8 million people, how do we make sure today that 7.8 million people are always included? How do we ensure that we leave no one behind, and whose responsibility is that? I have been very fortunate to live in a time where I've faced various challenges. I can honestly say that I personally have not felt the gender challenge. I do kind of feel the age challenge. One must understand that I live in a country where 2/3 of the population are below the age of 29. And in 2016, when our extremely transformational, forward-thinking Vision 2030 was announced, it very much focused on youth. And in many respects, many of us in my age group, which is not actually that old, but because of the demographics, somehow got skipped. Not old enough to retire, not young enough to be part of the 29 and below demographic. So there are lots of challenges when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Like I said, age, gender, abilities, and how we think about that in terms of moving forward is going to be absolutely critical. I personally am a proponent of not categorizing people into categories, but really reshifting our frameworks to think about what are the gaps that are preventing equity and a fair starting point, and how are they similar? Is a woman's challenge the same as a person with a disability who may be deaf? Is it the same as somebody from a lower socioeconomic background? Somebody with a different nationality, whether male or female, somebody from a different religious background. Some of these challenges may be joint, and the solutions may be beneficial to everyone. So how do we get outside of our boxes and start to think differently in a way that would benefit the biggest majority of people? So creative thinking is absolutely critical moving forward. Again, I think it's very important, not only us in Saudi Arabia, to realize that we're living during a historical time, but we all are. And listening to our personal stories and our personal facts help us all connect on how we are similar. Understanding the challenges that each of us face, the various differences that actually make us more similar in how we strive to address those differences. One of the shocking things that I often, again, have to take a step back and think about is in September 2020, Saudi Arabia celebrated our 90th birthday. 90 years. I speak to my father often, he will be 75 this year, And he talks about his friends that up until they were teenagers lived a nomadic life. They actually lived out in the desert. I remember in the 80s growing up in Riyadh, the capital, where there was a huge transition from moving people from living nomadic lives into transitioning into living into the cities. And I clearly remember having neighbors who brought their livestock with them, and the camels and the lambs would be in their front entrance because they were their prized possessions coming from the desert. Living a nomadic life meant survival of the fittest. You planned till tomorrow, and you learned the skills that you needed to survive until tomorrow. You did not have the long haul mindset. But that also gave us an added advantage and bonus within this community, is that it created agility, resilience, and adaptability. And again, being Western trained, I always thought that things would take a long time and they would need a lot to be able to shift and change, and you'd need generations. But what I've learned living in a community who has a more adaptive mindset is that change can happen extremely quickly, and very well adjusted change can happen. And we've certainly seen that in my lifetime here in Saudi Arabia when it comes to the monumental changes that everybody has seen on the world stage play out. Literally within a span of 7 months, we went from, women not driving to women driving very successfully with very little, if zero resistance, and adapting very quickly. The only thing holding back full mass turnout was just the ability to be trained safely to be able to drive. But till today, we see women going out, working, driving. Legislation has changed very quickly to allow for working environments that are friendly, supportive, and welcoming to women. We see that same legislation playing out for persons with disabilities, looking at how accommodations can be made to create the most productive and supportive environments. We also see across multiple diverse domains or career paths, women filling their shoes very adequately and commendably. So we see in all sectors, whether it's fashion, design, art, tourism, politics, business. We've seen during my lifetime the first ambassador. Now we have 2 female ambassadors serving abroad. We've also seen a deputy to the Speaker of the Shura Council be appointed fairly recently. We see within the sports arena women serving on multiple boards within our sports federations and communities. We see them serving and participating as athletes, whether it's in athletics, equestrian. We see programs supporting young children, both male and female, to get into gymnastics, to get into fencing, to get into bowling. So we're seeing a lot of engagement and inclusion across gender, across abilities, developing very quickly within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So that is very heartwarming and very promising for future generations. One of the things I want to point out here too is that these things don't just sprout out completely. We need to take into consideration what are the frameworks and the buildup and the natural development that sort of leads up to these kinds of accomplishments. We didn't wake up suddenly and find that we have these amazing chemists or genetic scientists or scientists that are focusing and researchers that are looking at climate change and the issues around renewable energy, whether they're male and female. We have both certainly within Saudi Arabia, and their publications and their research and their achievements and contributions speak for themselves. And that doesn't happen overnight. This has happened through systems that have created opportunities and support as we've gone along through our developmental history. And what we're planning and certainly striving for is to expedite and fast track even more of that as we move forward into very futuristic and ambitious projects and programs that will require the contribution of everyone within the community looking at that diversity. So what I can say is, in my short 30-year career, is I have seen diversity and inclusion wax and wane, but certainly stay on a track where, a developmental track, where it's always there. It's constantly discussed, examined, looked at, and supported in the best way possible at the time. And what I've learned during that time is leadership support and buy-in is absolutely critical to the success of sustainable development. 80% of success really depends on your leadership. Again, whether that leadership be a country leader, a community leader, a family leader, or even within your own mindset and your own leadership thoughts, that you really truly have the buy-in and your biggest support, and you are your own biggest supporter. Diversity and inclusion has to be linked to key business objectives. For people to get the buy-in, it has to be tangible. It has to be something that they can see and feel and sort of taste and want and think of as their own goal, and that in our success is their success, and we're all working towards one unified goal. An integrated approach and consistent framework creates the buy-in, sustainability, and momentum. Also, that sustainability is achieved by building internal capability to support diversity and inclusion. So we have to have multiple generations and multiple diverse contributors that lend their voices to the movement of diversity and inclusion, and through their own stories and their own inspiration and their own being there, they really create that environment that's inclusive to diversity and inclusion and help support it over time. Diversity and inclusion definitely should be approached strategically and as part of one's DNA in terms of how we think about things. It's not an add-on. It's not something that we think about post-mortem or after the fact. It should be something from the very beginning, pre-planning, original design, and it should be strategic. And it should be measured by outcomes and not necessarily the activities. So it's very critical, again, to have that strategic, unified goal, long-term vision of where we want to be as a society and where we think we're going. And as a final note, I just, it's always, again, this idea of categorizing and segmenting society into these groups. I think a very interesting mix coming up fairly soon, and we haven't even begun to really think about this in terms of diversity and inclusion, is the role of technology and AI, artificial intelligence, and the role artificial intelligence will take in some of the activities that we see, and how AI may even displace human participation in certain activities in the way we know life today and where we're going, and how much humanization of technology we want to maintain, and how do we utilize these developments to better further humanity and where we collectively want to go. So it'll be interesting to see where that takes us in the future, and how those discussions start to impact and change our definition of diversity and inclusion, whether it be gender, abilities, age, etc., any of those other areas that we've discussed. So on a final note, I just want to remind us, again, diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. And I hope, today we all really think about our choices and how we define them and our mindsets, and the support not only that we give to ourselves to motivate ourselves and inspire ourselves, but those that we give to others. And I please continue to share your stories and inspire. It's through sharing our narratives and our stories that we get to see the various lenses, the various opinions, the various mindsets, and we're able to widen our worldview and hopefully become more appreciative of other thought processes and mindsets, and how we can all better support, accommodate, and even compromise to allow room for everyone. Thank you very much. I wish you an amazing conference in the next day ahead. And for now, have a great evening.